Okay, and with that, I think we want to get started with this horticulture hour. And so the way this works is we're doing a Q&A. You may be able to see, we've got speakers out here today. So you have the option to unmute yourself and ask your question verbally if you would like. If you would not like to do that, you are, of course, welcome to ask questions in the chat, and I can ask them to our panel of experts. As you can see, we have Sophia, our nursery technician, with us. And on the far end, we've got Tim, our research technician, who does a lot of the gardening stuff. And of course, you all know Mark, our esteemed director. But we've got a new face here in the center. Mark, would you like to introduce?
Sure. Thank you very much for all the introductions and things that are going on. And I would, before I introduce our newest staff member here, I would like to encourage people to look ahead on our calendar, because we've got some great things coming up in January and February, some larger programs, some things on getting rid of or at least reducing your turf, some things on Piedmont prairies. And right on time is our 3:05 train. 3:05 on the dot. That's the only reason I know what time it is at all, is because the trains that go by. But we're really excited with this horticulture hour. We've brought in one of the experts in the country in horticulture and arboriculture, the care of trees. Our new director of horticulture, Greg Paige, who is somebody I've known for years and years and collaborated with, traveled to England with, traveled to Japan and Taiwan with. So really, we're excited to have him. And this is his first day on the job. So we roped him in immediately to test his mettle on our Stump the Chump horticulture hour.
I'm up to it.
He's not up to it yet. He needs to remember the microphones.
Okay. So, and again, this program is dependent on questions. So if we have any questions, please let's get them rolling. All right. And we've got our first one here from Catherine. She's saying, I have brought in crotons to winter over. She's in zone 7A. What is the best light to keep them in to retain color, and how much water do they need indoors? Thanks.
Anybody? Well, I'll go a little bit. I actually did interior scaping for a while when I was in college, believe it or not. Not a job I liked a whole lot, really. But crotons, they like a pretty fair bit of light. They're not terribly happy in a dark spot. So get them as sunny a place as you can. They will manage to keep limping along over the winter, and you get them back outside and they'll be great. Really cut down on the water a lot unless you have them right near an air vent that's blowing warm air by them, because that can really do a number on them. So try and keep them away from that, but in bright light. Reduce the water when they get dry. Be on the lookout for mealybugs and other creepy crawlies, because they're really prone to that. You can use some horticultural oil or something kind of not too terrible on it for that. Any other? And you can take Bryce's houseplants class and learn all about them.
There you go. That's the real answer right there. That's what you should do. Okay. So Will's asking, is there any indication that Piedmont clay soils are deficient in calcium or magnesium? Do it.
I don't know.
It really depends on if you have a new home, an old home, and what actually is outside in your yard, garden, that's actually soil. And the easiest way to do that is just to take a soil test. That's a good place to start. It's going to tell you those macronutrients, micronutrients, organic matter, everything you need to know to get good, healthy plants before you do anything. That's a good first start, and it's relatively inexpensive. You can do it through your extension service.
Yeah.
And off-season, they often don't charge here so I think it's in the spring that they start to charge again in early summer. November to May that you can do it free, more or less. So it's a great time to do that.
Yeah.
But it's hard to tell what is a deficiency and what isn't from those reports.
There's some really good resources online to help you read those. You can also get with your local extension agent and ask them. And, a lot of it depends on what you're growing. They're kind of designed for their crops, for farmers is how they're really originally kind of utilized. But if you're growing turf, the needs are going to be different than if you're growing, in a vegetable plot or if you're growing landscape plants. But it should, if you put on there what you want to grow, landscape plants, turf, whatever, on your soil test, the form you fill out with that, it'll give you those ranges and tell you, it gives you a range where you're inside the good range or outside that. And if you're in that good range, you're good. You don't need to do anything. If not, you can add some more, depending on what you're growing.
Yeah, and I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but in Bryce Lane's plant nutrition and fertilizing class, we did go over how to interpret those soil test reports. I guess they could sign up for that class. We do have the recordings for that. Anyway, he teaches it periodically, so look out for that one in the future if you want some good tips on how to interpret those tests as well.
And that may be a good idea for us to do during one of our gardening 101, tasks, ones to show you how to read one.
No kidding. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
I feel like the soil test thing comes up a lot. So good job. You passed the first test.
That's awesome. Okay, thank you so much for that question, Will. That was a good one. Okay, Carolyn's asking, I have a question about growing azaleas and Japanese maples in Raleigh. I just planted scores of these plants in the yard of my new home. I drip irrigated them for the growing season for 2 years. Should I continue with this irrigation or stop?
How often did she do it too?
You gotta speak into there. Don't ask us.
I mean, part of it would probably depend on how often you did it. If you were continually dripping, that plant probably doesn't have a good root system, I would guess. If you did a periodic deep watering the plant and let the plant root in really well, it's probably, you can cut it back. I wouldn't have it on consistently unless we're having a drier period, but you can save water that way.
Yeah, we tend to plant things here. We water them when it's dry and when they're first in. But unless it gets really dry, we kind of let things go. Drip irrigation is great. It saves on water, but there's a tendency to put out too little too often, leading to really shallow root systems, which azaleas and maples tend to have fairly shallow root systems. So whatever you're doing for watering, water less frequently and more deeply. But if they're well established after 2 years, I don't think they would need much except for when it is very, very dry. I know you at the Bartlett Research Arboretum, where you've been for years, you've got a phenomenal collection. You had a phenomenal collection of rhododendron and azalea.
We planted them high so they weren't in clay, which is important. Lots of organic matter. Harkening back to testing the soil, that's important, the pH. But like Tim said, less is more as they get older. You really don't need to, and we're not saying remove the irrigation because it's good to have that in case you do go into a drought. But I've always erred on the side of tough love in most gardens that I've worked at. Either you didn't have the resource or water is a premium. So if they've been in the ground for 2 years, they're probably pretty well established. And I wouldn't pull the plug directly, like Tim said. You can do that gradually at this point, and they should be fine.
Awesome. Cool. Okay. So Marilyn's asking, if I have a plant such as a rose bush or a Japanese maple that's been in a container, such as a half whiskey barrel, for several years and needs to have the soil refreshed, soil shaken out or washed out and new soil replaced, is it better to do that now so that the roots can grow in the new soil over the winter, or do it in February/early March just before the new growth might start? Sophia, I see your hand moving towards the microphone. What do you think about this?
I think I would wait. If they're already in a container, I would wait, because if you replant them now, they may, like, I don't know why, but that's just my gut.
Yeah. There was one summer,
They're not.
or there was one winter when Sophia and I were working in the teaching nursery for Helen, and we repotted a bunch of, they were Itea virginica Henry's garnets right before the winter. And we did it because they were incredibly root bound, and we were worried that the roots weren't going to be happy over the winter. But like every single one of them died that winter because it got exceedingly cold. Whereas everything else that was incredibly root bound that we didn't repot, it was all fine. It was all fine. So that more anecdotal for you.
Yeah, and then they'll be actively growing, and I would wait.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in you do things when you have time, because I don't have time in spring and fall. But I would tend towards wanting to do it a little bit earlier in the season, so that you've knocked out some of the old soil, you've repotted it, you put it in, it's still warm enough that they are rooting into the new pots and getting reestablished before it gets really cold. So wouldn't wait until December, and if not, then wait till it gets later and you're moving into spring and it's going to go into active growth. However, with something like roses or Japanese maples, which are very cold hardy, you probably have less of an issue with that, but there's always that chance. If you do it right now, we're going to blame you for the actual cold winter we have this year. So It's on you whether you want to do it. All us gardeners will give you the stink eye.
I agree with that. Well said, Mark. Okay. Lennox is saying, when is the best time to prune peach trees? I assume for getting the most peaches.
Well, the best time is really, you usually prune them over winter. You thin them out, because if you are looking for fruit production, you don't want too many flowers, because you get too many fruit and they don't get large enough. And as I was taught, you prune them so that you can swing a cat through them without hitting any branches. I should have learned my lesson today, because I got in trouble for saying something else similar to that.
What size cat?
What size cat?
Because I have an 8-pound cat and a 20-pound cat. So which cat am I throwing in the peach tree?
Go for the median. And the other thing with most fruit trees, you see it a lot with apples, but same with peaches, they will flower and fruit best on branches that are more horizontal. So when you're pruning, you want to prune so that you have fewer branches going up and more branches going out. In fact, if you go by some old orchards and things, you'll see cinder blocks and things hanging from branches to get them to lay out flat. So if you want a beautifully shaped plant, you'll get a little bit less fruit because you'll have that nice shape. If you want a lot of fruit, it's going to be kind of funky looking, kind of vase-shaped and low, but that also lets you pick the fruit.
Okay. Alrighty, so Jan's asking what to do about a yard with lots of moles and or voles. And I assume this is a well-established garden. Go, Tim.
And it's soil amendment.
Okay.
There's a lot of ground cover, green stuff that we call yard, plus a lot of plantings around the edges. But it looks like the ocean with waves out in the yard, and it's mushy.
Oh, okay. So is it you have ground covers?
Some ground covers, and we were wondering why some of our hydrangea bushes were not thriving like we assumed they would, like others did. And so we think maybe they got to those also. But is there a way to get rid of those things or to drive them away?
I'm not sure, the rodenticides and stuff, but I don't get into that so much. But the ground covers will often live among that area, and then that's why I ask about that. But you can use soil amendments, like we use permatil, which kind of deters them a little bit, theoretically. That's good. I'd say snakes. Natural predators are excellent for dealing with those. Owls. If you're in a forested area, around here we have barred owls, and they're known to be really good hunters of voles and stuff. So don't inhibit anything. Everyone's afraid of snakes, but black rat snakes are wonderful, for instance. Don't kill any snakes in your yard, and those will actually help you out a bit too. And it seems like you might have something.
I would stay away from the rodenticides
Yeah.
because of if that rodent ingests the rodenticide and an owl takes that, it's going to transfer it through the food chain. It's been a huge problem in a lot of gardens I've worked in, and it took me a visit here to realize about the stay-lite, or we used a smaller gravel at planting. That works really, really well. I've had people ask me where you can buy snakes. You really can't do that. And if you release them, they're not going to stay where you want them to. Cats are very helpful. Longwood Gardens in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania uses cats in some of their hillside plantings to help control them. But it's a bad pest, and I found it's kind of cyclical. Every couple of years, it's really bad. Another year, you don't hardly see it. But encouraging predators is important. Maybe trying to plant new things high with that gravel mix around the planting site, because they need those galleries to move around and feed. Other than that, there's not a whole lot and there's no rhyme or reason to what they eat either. They pretty much will hit anything we've found out. It's a bad pest, unfortunately.
Yeah, and there's two. So there's two different things. You said moles and voles, and those are different things. Often voles will use mole tunnels, so you often have both, or you'll have had moles and then have voles. But voles eat your plants. Moles are digging around to find grubs, worms, insects. And so one of the long-term ways to get rid of moles, or to reduce the number, is to get rid of grubs in your soil. So milky spore is a powder that you can put down that just affects the beetle grubs that are in your turf. So that can help get rid of the moles over the long term, which will in turn also help with the voles. I agree with Scott. We found at a garden I worked at where we had terrible.
Okay.
Greg.
You think of Scott McMahon.
Or Scott Arboretum, I don't know, Greg. But it was his first day. I can't remember his name. I've only known him for 20 years. Mixing in just sharp gravel or permatil, we had a big problem at another garden I worked at in a specific spot, and we just started putting in one shovelful, just kind of mixing it in with the backfill that we were going in, and it was like a miracle cure for them. I was just at somebody's garden here locally who was using a little sonic type deterrent that goes out and emits a real high-pitched noise. And it worked really well, she was saying. And she's a great gardener. I have never used those myself, but, they don't get rid of them. They just keep them away from, a single area. So you may have to do multiples of them.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. Okay. So we got a question from Griffin Trees. So I think this one's for you, Greg. While you do not want to mulch completely up to the tree, what difference does it make when trees in natural habitat accumulate pine straw around it year after year? So I guess the virtues of mulch.
Mulch is one of the single most easy ways to improve plant health care. So it's strongly encouraged for that, if nothing else. It helps reduce compaction, which is also important with trees. The Achilles heel is what we like to call mulch volcanoes, which is piling it around the root flare of a tree. That part of the tree's physiology isn't used to having something up against it, so that's very detrimental. So 3 to 4 inches up to that point. In nature, where it's mostly leaf litter or pine needles, that's very porous, and it doesn't hold moisture against that trunk, which causes problems. It's also can be a home for voles that we just talked about. But that's an easy thing to do in your garden, is just to keep that area free of mulch. Pine needles not as big of a deal because they are porous. They break down relatively quickly, and not to go down the rabbit hole of selecting mulch. I love the look of pine needle, but it's probably one of the least most effective because it's so porous. It doesn't do a lot for temperature control, doesn't hold a lot of moisture, doesn't release a lot of organic matter. Wood chips and leaf compost are the two best things to use for that. And it does amazing things for plant health care, something that simple.
Okay, great. Okay, this one's fun. This is from Maryland. If I want a continuum of bloom through the fall, winter, late winter of Galanthus, what is the sequence of bloom of the various species, Elwesii, Nivalius, Wilronii, etc.? And do they have any differing requirements for soil moisture, sun, etc.?
Want to go? I couldn't answer all of it, but I can.
Sure.
I can't answer all that, but right now in the garden we have Elwesii. But if you went a little bit earlier than the Elwesii, you have it's Reginae Olgae, the Queen Olga, which typically is up to a month earlier. They'll start actually in October, while the Elwesii, the monostictus forms, we actually have in the garden right now flowering. They've been started in early November, and some of the Elwesii, they go right into March for us. If you get a whole bunch of different forms of those, Nivalis tends to be a bit in the main season. Wilcomii, I think, is a bit, or the not Wilcomii, is it Wilcomii? No, the W one. I can't spit it out, but anyways, that's a later flowering one too. I think there's whole books on Galanthus. I can't really. I mean, those are the ones I know, and I know a few of them. Placatus is often an early to mid season one. It'll be right after the early Elwesii, so we'll get those in December, mid to late December. We start to get them, but so those are some of them. We can probably have. Let's see, October, November, December, January, February, probably 6 months that you can have easily here in this area where you can have some Galanthus in flower. But you just have to do your research. And there's different forms within, different cultivars and selections within each species that vary on their timing. So there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
So
I'm just gonna
get with the Brits. They know their Galanthus.
Sure.
So.
And just off the top of your head, Tim, that answer was phenomenal. Honestly,
Really good.
I've spent a lot of time making fun of those, especially British galanthophiles who are really into it. This one has green tips on the petal, and this one has slightly different green tips on the petal, and this one has green tips on the petal and a little dot of green on the sepals. But I did plant a bunch of Galanthus last year at my house, so I may become one of those people.
Alrighty. So Will is asking, is there a Stewartia malacodendron not in a raised bed thriving at the Ralston Arboretum? No. Tim's shaking his head.
We don't have one here, but I've certainly grown them in, collections with camellias and, under high pines. They're tough in heavy clay soil. I think Greg here probably has some thoughts on growing those.
That's a plant that I probably killed more than anything in horticulture. And Mark and I think, are friends with a local expert in Georgia, Jack Johnson, who's Mr. Stewartia. And he came to visit me one time to show me where to plant them. And they're in some of the most inhospitable parts of your garden because that is a tree that thrives on tough love. I had a big one at my previous job that I used to go out to every year to take pictures of it in flower. And for whatever reason, we had a good mild winter this last year. I went out there and it was completely dead to the ground because it was right next to an irrigation head, lots of organic matter around it, and it finally succumbed to some kind of root disease. So that's a plant that really thrives, and from my experience, on some form or fashion of tough love.
Okay, great, thanks. Carolyn's asking, is there a good way to keep my neighbor's Vinca minor from taking over my yard?
cut it. Just go along the edge of your property with a weed eater and keep it a straight line there. I mean, that's about it. Spray it all with Roundup and at midnight and say, I don't know what happened.
Yeah, but it's just going to come back. It's just going to pop back up. Yeah, I would say just stay on it, keep up with it, like maintain that edge and don't let it encroach.
Yeah, if you really hate it, and you are good friends with your neighbor, or at least on good speaking terms, you could suggest maybe that you would, if you're willing, help them find an alternative and help get rid of what's there and plant something else that you might like a little bit more.
Can I add to my question?
Yeah, go for it.
You mentioned Roundup, brush killer, that sort of thing. Is it okay to do that like this time of year? I killed a mess of it in the summer. I just sprayed it and it died. But it will not be stopped and it keeps coming back. Like, could I spray the stuff that's out there now?
You could, and it would have some effect. Roundup, glyphosate really works in inhibiting photosynthesis, although there's some other modes of action as well. Really, what I've found the most effective thing for plants that can be tough to get rid of, like say English ivy, is when the new growth is coming out in spring, still small, not even fully formed. You spray it then. That will do a number on it, and then you come back maybe a month later. If it's starting to re-sprout and you hit it again then, and usually that'll do a pretty good job of knocking it out. You could spray it now and it would kill some, but I don't think it would be nearly as effective as if you just waited till spring.
Be really careful with the Roundup products that you buy too. There's a lot of different flavors now. There's brush killer ones that have glyphosate and other stronger chemicals in it that are really, really dangerous in terms of spreading to things that you don't want to kill. Some of them will stay in the soil a little bit longer. So really read the label before you purchase those. And another good time frame is early fall for controlling things like, ligustrum or really woody type of invasive plants, because that plant is taking a lot of its reserves into the root system, and it'll move that herbicide in a little bit quicker, and you'll have a better control.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, this question's from Griffin. This one might be fun for Sophia. This question came up in a recent presentation. If you are to water a plant that needs an inch of water a week and you're hand watering, how much water on a plant is roughly equivalent to get 1 inch? There's a lot of variables to that, aren't there?
I feel like I need a pencil or a spreadsheet with a formula in it.
Trains pass.
Yeah, is it in the ground, I'm assuming?
Let's assume as such.
I mean,
That's something to consider.
Yeah. It wasn't clear if it was pot. I thought it might be in a pot since it was. I don't know.
Can I just say, I don't know what that means. If Greg knows what it means, I've heard that. I was taught that in school, an inch of water a week. And
I know the concept, but it's something that we put in quite like literally. We type it up once in a spreadsheet and then, figure it out and do the math. Like you've just got to do the math.
I don't do any math for it.
I mean, it's watering deep and less often is what I always tell people when they ask that question, because it depends on the type of soil, how much organic matter, the plant. That looks good in a slide, and I'm sure I have that same slide in several of my talks. But what I always end up telling people is water deeply but less frequently, and timing of watering too is important. You don't want to wet foliage in the heat of the summer and let that sit on plants overnight too. So there's lots of different factors in that for plant health.
And you could have a 1 gallon, if it is in a pot, you could have a 1 gallon agave and a 1 gallon begonia, and the people say an inch of water a week. Well, that agave may not need water much at all, and that begonia may need an inch of water every 3 days. So and same thing with the ground. What time of year is it? What's the weather like? Is it been really hot? Is it shade or sun? And so more plants are killed from overwatering than underwatering, especially in containers. So you're better off underwatering than overwatering always. But when you do water, water deeply.
And I feel like the only time I've ever used that is in a research setting. So like we need to know, we have emitters, like I don't know, was there how are we watering? What is he watering with? Is it a watering can?
He wants to know if he's hand watering.
Oh, like-
taking a recommendation of an inch of water a week, what does
Okay.
that equate to a hand water? So, yeah.
Yeah, it depends
Don't
on
need
your
that.
it depends on your rate. Yeah, there's so many variables, and I feel like if you look at the plant and you look at the ground, and
You're saying
Take-
water
take
with
it
your
in.
heart. Is
Water
that what
with
you're
your
saying?
heart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Feel the
Feel-
soil.
touch the plant, ask it if it needs water. Like it sounds. I mean, but really look at it. If the soil feels moist, and it's an established plant, like you're good to go. If you planted it yesterday, well,
I water very, very little at my home garden. Very, very little. I plant in a woodland. I plant in full sun. I water very little, as evidenced by what little turf I have. And I use that word advisedly. It is green, but not necessarily grass. So, really cut back on it. You'll keep more plants alive than you'll kill by watering deeply and infrequently.
Nice. Okay.
I feel like we've said that like 12 times.
Sure. Well, that's good
water
advice.
deeply and frequently, and take a soil test.
Yes. There you go. That's all you need to know about gardening right there.
Mic drop.
We're out.
Okay. Anna is asking, well, she says her niece has some blueberry bushes in the mountains of North Carolina, Burnsville, if that matters. Since this is a vacation home, she doesn't get up here to take care of them so much, and they are neglected. There does seem to be a lot of old growth on them. I haven't seen very many fruit buds. Is there any saving them? I think they are native high bush blueberries.
I would prune them.
Yeah.
But have you seen fruit on them in the past?
Yeah. They're
And they're
just
just
old
overgrown?
and they've just overgrown. Yeah.
Yeah. I like to prune things, so I would say prune it. And if it's still showing growth, I would say it's savable. You may not get fruit this year, but
You probably want to thin out the old canes.
Yeah.
And the late winter or mid to late winter is probably a good time. You can see them. You can see that they're typically probably grayer. The new canes are going to be smooth and probably have more red tint to them. And you get rid of a lot of that older stuff. If you can have to take parts of it to the ground, that might happen. But you want to thin that out and encourage those younger shoots to come up through on that. I would say, and if they're high bush blueberries, they can get quite large. So it also helps to keep them down to a size that you can maintain them yourself. So.
The other thing I'd check is, you mentioned overgrown and neglected. So the pruning is important for those, but are they getting shaded out or other trees growing up? They're not going to produce as much if they're not getting good light. So, and also if you're not going up there that often, they may be fruiting like crazy and the birds are getting them before you see them because the birds will go through there. And, the black bears too. I've seen quite a few of those in recent years up in the mountains.
Burnsville is one of my favorite places on the planet, so I'm volunteering to go check on them for you.
Beautiful. Okay, staying in the vein of fruits, this one will go with what you were talking about earlier with peaches. Cindy says, my peaches always get rotten before they get ripe. What can I spray on my peach that will prevent this? She says she'd prefer not to use anything that will harm the environment if possible.
Peaches get everything. And we all say we want, stuff without spray all over it. And yet when we go to the grocery store, we buy the shiny, clean, pristine fruit. We don't want the stuff with spots on it. There are some copper sprays that can be used on peaches to prevent some of the fungal diseases. I'm not a big I don't know my sprays very well because I don't like to spray. Here in Raleigh, we have a great farmer's market. I'm not fighting with fruit trees. They're a pain in the rear a lot of times to get good fruit on them. And so I will go support my local family farm at the farmer's market and get delicious peaches all through the season, get different types, get those Oriental pearls early on. And, yeah. So that's me. There is, I am certain, because we have great faculty here, extension faculty at NC State. I am certain if you go to NC State Extension and search for peach care, there are great resources there that will give you everything you need to know.
Yeah, and there are great resources. And one thing I'd like to point out, one of the major reasons, if you prune your peach tree, like Mark was talking about earlier, and you thin your fruit out, as the extension materials will suggest, that will allow more airflow into the canopy of the tree, and that will reduce the amount of fungal pressure on your peaches. So that's two cultural things you can do to help reduce the rotting. And if you want to avoid spraying altogether, you might just start with properly pruning and thinning out your fruit.
Yeah, two more little thoughts. One, another thing for fungal problems is sulfur. You can do some sulfur powders and sprays. It can be a little difficult to get good coverage on your trees, and I don't know the timing for doing that with peaches. The other thing, I believe there might be on our YouTube channel, I believe there might be from quite a few years ago, but a talk by Dr. Mike Parker from NC State on peaches, and he may talk a little bit about that.
Okay, awesome. Okay, we're gonna keep the ball rolling with fruit. Donna says she bought an Italian fig tree in October with the intention of planting it, but wasn't able to dig up the rocky clay soil. Read online I could put it in a very large pot, trim back, and keep it in the garage all winter. I live in Wake Forest, which is zone 7B. Will it survive in the garage, and should I water it a little? Go ahead, Sophia.
Yeah, it should.
Sure.
You could keep it outside. You could keep it outside next to your house if we get a really cold winter. If we get a really, really cold where it might freeze, you could bring it in.
Yeah.
But
Sure. What
should
about
work.
watering?
Well, a little bit, but not often.
Yeah.
I would just,
No.
if like you said, leave it out. And if it gets natural rain, unless we're calling for really
Yeah.
cold weather, single digits, it should be fine as long as it's in a
Yeah.
decent sized container.
Yeah,
And you don't need to worry about watering it so much.
yeah,
And being that it's recently repotted, it's not going to need as much water.
and I would say don't cut it back. Just leave it. Let it hang out outside. If it gets really cold and it might freeze like solid, I might bring it in. But if it's up next to the house, it usually is fine.
Definitely. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Linda says that they have a smoke bush, Catinus cagigria, that has not bloomed. They bought it in 3 gallon and it has now been in the ground for 2.5 years and has never bloomed. Full sun, zone 7B, Raleigh. What do I need to get some blooms? Thanks.
I don't know. Sometimes plants just take a while. I would think it would be blooming by now. The only thing is, often you will hear, to really get the most out of your smoke bush, especially if it is a purple leafed or gold leafed one, is to cut them back hard, because then they come back really vigorous, larger leaves, really intense color, but they flower on older wood, so you don't get flowers if you cut them back hard like that. Otherwise, if they're getting good light and they're growing well, I don't really know.
I've seen people fertilize things too much too, and if you give something too much nitrogen, that's going to push foliage growth and not really help the flowers, which need phosphorus. So I would err again on the side of caution, and if you're going to fertilize, make sure you've got something with that middle number. If it's an NPK, the middle number is a little bit bigger than the nitrogen. And again, all things in moderation with plant health care.
You can do that test too, that soil test.
I just want to recognize that Blake said the full Latin name in a public setting of a plant that nobody wants to say that cagigria, because it just never feels right to say it. So
when I say cagigria, it feels right to me, and I just go with that.
There you go. So I just wanted to recognize that. Well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. Catherine's asking, is it too late to move established azaleas now in Zone 7A?
I think it's almost the perfect time. I think ideally a few weeks ago, but still in a good window.
I just wrote in, I don't know, e-update newsletter or something like that, and I mentioned it here, I don't get any gardening done in spring or fall because we're so busy. All of my personal gardening is done in July and August and late December, January, early February, because that's when I have time. So anything that's moved is moved high summer, middle of winter, and, you know, plants want to live. Or to harken back to Doug, who's no longer here at the Arboretum, unfortunately, plants want to live, except hybrid tea roses.
Beautiful. Okay, Doug's legacy living on. Gotta love it. Alrighty, Carolyn's asking, question about how big plants have to be planted outside in the ground. And she's asking because she participated in the June plant propagation workshop and has several plants that are in 5-inch pots. Some are deciduous and they are dying back, and she's not sure where to keep them. In the garage window, inside the house, outside in a clear plastic box, outside in the ground, and how often should I water them?
If you could probably plant them, it's just keeping track of them if they're small. That's the only thing I find. So you don't tramp on them if they're woody ones, and just so you know where they're at. And they should be, most of them should be perfectly content to be planted right now.
Yeah.
And if they're outside, you probably don't have to water them excessively other than when you first plant them. Because in the winter, if they're dormant, they're not going to need an excessive amount of water.
So they're in like 5-inch pots?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they're perfectly good. A lot of what we sell like on our little plant cart here, as long as they have a good root ball and you don't lose track of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If I had my way at my home garden, with the exception of a few things that really are not hardy here, and I'm trying to really give them a little more wood on them, like palms, I would plant nothing larger than a quart pot if I could. Right there. That is the perfect size to me. I can protect it from deer really easily. And I will, this time of year, if I planted that, I would water it in really, really well. And then I would go out and enjoy it all winter long and watch it flush out in spring and think it was a great plant. And I would not water it again unless it got really hot and dry over the summer. I wouldn't water it this winter. Now, if it's an evergreen, I might not plant it out where it's real windy. It may need a little bit of moisture, but we have wet winters, so probably not. So that's me. I think plants establish better, quicker, and easier small than they do large.
And we talked about overwatering as an easy way to kill plants. Plants with poor root systems are the next thing. So a younger plant is going to have a better developed root system than something that starts out in that container, then goes to a 3-gallon, then a 5-gallon, then a 10, then a 15, and has the girdling root issues. So just because it's bigger doesn't mean it's going to establish better. That's a much better mindset. Is it's going to have a better root system the younger that it is, and it should be fine into the growing season.
Okay, great. So Ula says that they have 2 urns on their front porch with pennymac hydrangeas planted this spring. They get 3 to 4 hours of morning sun and only get watered when dry. I have a chronic problem with powdery mildew. I have tried all sorts of remedies like baking soda, milk, etc. The only 2 things that have worked are neem oil and propiconazole. I stumbled on that one a little bit, but it still comes back 2 to 3 weeks later. Please help.
Put something else in your pots.
There you go.
Alternatively, have you changed out the soil? Because is that soil buoyant with if it's on old leaves? I don't know.
It's a fungus, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
And
Or
for
try a
me,
different
I don't like
variety.
Hydrangea macrophyllus. I would go for something, not a quercifolia, or you could do a quercifolia or an arborescens if you're really wanting a hydrangea in there. And they tend to be a bit easier going to me than macrophyllus, which are a little more needy. They want more water and nutrients, I think, than arborescens and quercifolias.
So I get, penny mac, it's small size, it's a good rebloomer. And one of the things you can do for powdery mildew is a little bit of, a couple teaspoons of baking soda, yeah, not powder, in a gallon of water, a drop of soap in there. Because what you need to do, one of the things you can do to prevent powdery mildew is change the pH on the leaf surface. And so that actually does work pretty well. You do have to redo it. The powdery mildew is all around, and hydrangeas tend to be pretty dense, and they can get that. But I wasn't joking when I said get a different plant. There are so many plants out there, including hydrangeas. There are other hydrangeas, other big leaf hydrangeas that are more powdery mildew resistant. Often will have a thicker, glossier leaf. But they're just, we grow 8,000 different plants here. I'm a big believer in, if somebody says my plant always gets X, what do I spray on it? My response is always, why would you want to spray your plants? That is the most miserable job. Get rid of it and plant something else that won't give you that problem. There's my, that's really what I think, especially if they're by your door, 2 pots by your front door, and you're spraying stuff on them that doesn't smell good or is gross. Just don't.
Sure.
It's my thought.
That's fair, Mark. I'm right there with you. Yeah. Okay, so Carolyn's asking, is there a good way to keep squirrels from chewing the bark of my Japanese maples? Oh, boy. Y'all can see what Greg just did, yes?
There's there's a line of repellents called I Must Garden, and they are essential oil based. I was going to mention them earlier with the mole and vole question because they have a mole and vole one too. So they're essential oils. Not really. And they smell decent, but they have a squirrel repellent. Maybe try that.
Okay.
We've done, in my past job, tons of research trying to figure that one out, and also sapsuckers. I actually have a plastic owl that I brought with me that was a remnant of a research trial for that. Wrapping them with burlap can help, but that's a lot of work. Somebody jokingly told me that does a lot of Christmas tree light stuff, a friend of mine that works at the Cincinnati Zoo, that's what they do to keep the squirrels from ripping up the bark on the trees, is wrap them with Christmas tree lights. It's they can be a bit of a nuisance, and there's really not much that I know of that you can do to get them under control. I've got a Scottish Terrier that likes to try to chase them and catch them, but to no avail. There really isn't a good answer to that.
Well, dang. So, okay. So I would like to say that we've got about 30 new messages in the chat. I assume they're all questions. We've been doing this a while, so I'll say we'll take 3 more questions, and I apologize to everybody to the 27 of you that I didn't get to, but we're going to take 3 more questions and call it a day. I think that sounds good to me. Okay, so Johnny says, pomegranate tree, several years established, that grows and blooms beautifully but produces no fruit. Any idea what is needed in Kill Devil Hills on the Sound?
Is it a fruit and cultivar? Is it a double flowered one, or is it a single flowered one?
That is a fair question, Johnny.
Because a lot of times the double flowered ones, if they produce a fruit, it's really mangled. That's just a thought. And I don't know.
Don't they need a longer growing season?
Kill Devil Hill should be fine. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to go with Tim. It's it depends on the variety that you have. And, the number one fruiting variety that's sold is Wonderful. Wonderful is not a very good one for us. But there are other fruiting ones that they tend to not have the beautiful names and, poetic names of other ones. But yeah, Kill Devil Hills, they're they love Mediterranean climate. Kill Devil Hills, they should really do well there. So if it's that really full carnation-like doubled flower, you really got an ornamental flowering one, not a fruiting one. Maybe we'll propagate some fruiting ones. We've got a bunch in the nursery that Sophia managed to loosen my tight grip on all the extra ones we had. So I got rid of some of them. Now we just need to propagate more.
And one that we have in the garden that's actually produced a decent fruit, not a lot of them yet, we haven't had a terribly long time, is I think it's Savalosky, which is a Russian one, which has been pretty hardy here. So the hardiness I don't think should be an issue out there, but that might be one to try if you can find it.
Yeah, and that's probably the one of the easier ones to find, Savlatsky. But there are several with Russian names because they were doing breeding for cold hardiness and fruit production. I've got one at home called Mini Francis that's only this big and it fruits like mad. Of course, there's only about 4 seed in each one, but so it'll be a while to make a cup of juice out of that.
Okie dokie. Carolyn's asking, are there any ferns that do well in Raleigh clay without irrigation? It would be an upland location, not near a water source. Should I put drip irrigation on them? The few I have planted have not done well.
Have you tried the Christmas fern, Pilisticum? And I always mess up the specific epithet on it. It's like,
Acrosticoides.
Thank you. And like Drought-tolerant erythrosaur, one of the more common ones, the autumn fern. Those are two that are pretty consistently easy. Some of the holly ferns, like Sertomium falcatum, that one's another one that's pretty tolerant about any conditions. Those are 3 offhand. There's a bunch of others, though.
Yeah, ostrich fern is a really, really tough drought tolerant one. Those are some of the easiest, but I find ferns pretty reliable, and a lot of the evergreen ones seem to do well in the heavier soils and drier soils we have.
Maybe not a heavy soil, but if dry periodically, unfern-like, the pyrosias, Pyrosia lingua on a slope, it's one that's very drought tolerant. It's an epiphyte in the wild or lithophyte. So those are sometimes might be ones to try too.
Okay. All right. And this is the last question. I know there's a lot more, but this will be the last one. It's from Kate. It says, I have a very large metasequoia, probably 60 years old or more, about 90 feet tall, which seems healthy, but this year it's shed a lot of small branches, including many that he'd never leafed out at all. I don't see foliage turning brown, but this is a new phenomenon. Any thoughts?
Is it the older growth that's shaded out in the inside, or is it the outer branches?
Oh boy. This is a lot of the small branches.
Because if they're in the inside, they often get shaded out, and the plant will naturally shed them. That's just a thought there. But
We had a cold snap, a late cold snap this year, and I noticed on Taxodium and Metasequoia that some of the tips got a little bit burnt from that weather. And and also the older they get, they're not as messy as like a river birch or something, but they will shed a lot of interior branches, and they're not that big. They've just been shaded out, and it's just the way that the tree cleans itself. And that's one of the things about taking care of a mature tree is that kind of stuff where they drop branches and twigs and things like that.
As a general rule of thumb with most trees especially, but shrubs too, when you're seeing a problem, if it's on the interior, is much less chance that's a real problem. If it's on the outsides of it, the branch tips and that kind of thing, that's where it's a problem. We get it every year. I get questions about pines and other conifers. My needles are turning orange on there. I say, well, is it interior? And they say, yes. I say, well, that's the old needles. And they say, but it's an evergreen, and evergreen does not mean forever. There's a certain number of years that conifers and things like that live. So when it's on the interior, you're usually okay.
Okay, great. So that is all the time we have for today. So I would like to thank all of you for all of your wonderful questions. This has been a very engaging conversation. I feel like this has been a lot of fun. We learned a lot. We got to talk about a bunch of great plants and meet our new horticulture director. So that This has been a great success, I do believe. So thank you for joining us this week. Please join us again next week, where we'll be doing Gardening 101 December gardening casts with Tim and Sophia. That should be fun as always. I do like those ones. They're simple and fun. So yeah, thanks again for joining us, and we'll see y'all next time. Take care.